So with the agenda today, we've got a number of items to cover in our hour and a half together, and hopefully we'll get through all of them. And if any of them bring a lot of discussion, then that's fine, because we would rather cover something and discuss it than try to just push the entire agenda. So we can always communicate anything we missed in the Google group or through email and things like that. So on our agenda today, we have a few items. We're going to kind of follow through on the CE terms Credential Person. We brought that up during our last TAC, and Stuart will just do a real quick recap on where that landed. We're going to just do a reminder on the release cycle and how that works. And then we're going to bring forward a ConditionManifest proposal that Nate and Stuart will cover. So that will affect the CTDL. We want to give everyone an update on the roadmap analysis and crosswalking of partner data. We've been covering a little bit about that with each TAC since we convened our group of 9 to 10 of our partners who we want to go through an analysis process and then essentially implement the CTDL so we can begin to populate the registry in an automated fashion rather than a manual fashion. And the Credential Registry update, and we're going to just hone in on just the usage and validation of the CTDL, and you'll see as we go forward that we'll have more time spent on the registry each month as opposed to the CTDL. So we'll cover more about that. But this month we're going to focus on the usage and the validation of the CTDL. Now this PowerPoint, Scarlett, if you can go ahead and copy paste a couple of things into the chat for URLs. So the Google group folder has all the presentation materials in it. And let's go ahead, Scarlett, and copy paste the folders in there. So everybody in this meeting should have access to the TAC Google folder, and then we have subfolders. So we have a March 31st folder with all of today's materials in there, including this PowerPoint. So people can go directly to those. If anyone has any trouble accessing them, please feel free to let us know either in the chat or send us a note and email so we can make sure that you get access to the materials. And with that said, I'd like to go ahead and move on to the first topic, the Credential Person, and ask Stuart to talk a little bit about that and kind of just summarize where things landed based on the feedback that we received.
Jean, would it be okay if we did, before we launched into this, we did a fast statement about Jim Goodell and the CEDS?
Yeah, we can definitely do that. Actually, I have it right here, and I'll copy and paste it into the chat. As Stuart was saying, Jim Goodell, who is responsible for facilitating the CEDS, C-E-D-S, for those who might not know that acronym. I'm going to put this in the chat. Wanted us to mention that there's a public comment period for a version 7 of the CEDS, and he's inviting all members of this group to participate, take a look at that, and participate and make comments. And Stuart, are there any other details about that you would like everyone to know about?
Well, in particular, why he was asking us to look at it is that they are beginning to incorporate some of the CTDL concepts and so forth in the CEDS. Not everything, but select properties. And I have not seen it yet, but anyway, this was just an alert, and he couldn't be here today, so he asked us to have you take a look at it. Okay, so I don't know if anybody has any questions about that. I think at this point, none of us are in a position to really answer any questions because I haven't looked at it either yet. So anyway, Credential Person, as you know, we sent out a survey. It's been a month or maybe probably longer than that ago, about the possibility of asking whether we should retain Credential Person as a subclass of agent. We've got credentialing organization, credentialing organization, and credentialing QA organization. And Person has been there for a long time at the early request of people in the TAC. It has not gotten the attention that the organizational entities had gotten. And so we looked at it, and because we don't deal with credential awards or awarded credentials, so we don't deal with so persons in this context are not people who earned a credential, but people who are play one of the credentialing roles of approving, Gene, you fill in if I miss, approving, recommending a credential, but they play some role in direct actions relating to a credential. So they're not the earner. So anyway, we did the survey, and there is a link to the survey responses here, summary of those, and plus a GitHub issue. But our conclusion that I posted to the Google group, to our Google group, was that the question was, should we not remove it but deprecate it and not do anything with Credential Person? And there is no consensus to remove it. So Credential Person remains. Our scope is in going forward, and I think we probably need to, in addition to the definition, do a comment here that more specifically defines person in terms of someone who accredits is not there, but approves. What are some of the others, Gene? I can't even think of what they are at the moment. But to tie
the main one with offers, I believe.
Yeah, offers. Well, but offers recommend, things that are directly tied to them as an agent in relationship to the credential and not as a recipient of credential. So that we kind of foreclose it in terms of clearly in terms of our scope, which is not to get over into that other territory. So so anyway, that was sort of our conclusion, that we needed to narrow the definition down so that it stayed within scope as best we can, keep it within scope, and then handle some of the other things that came up in the comments in a different way. For example, there were a few comments that talked about a significant, recognizable instructor in a learning opportunity, and others, the master in an apprentice relationship. Things around learning opportunities and assessments where some party of significance might be important. And our conclusion was that we should look at learning opportunity and assessment profile for the capability of including a reference to such persons in relation to a learning opportunity or to an assessment. But that did not rise to the level of creating a full-blown description of a credential person. One of the things we want to avoid is becoming some kind of a mechanism like LinkedIn or something where people are simply registering themselves, but to keep it as focused as possible. So that means looking at assessment profile, looking at the learning opportunity profile to see whether we accommodate a reference or identifying such parties, such persons. And so that was sort of where the conclusion that we came down to. And what you're seeing here is us, our stab at this point, since this is in pending for the current, for an upcoming release, which will be talked about in a few moments. We wanted to include our take on what those pared down properties for person might look like. So what you see here are properties which are a small number of those that are there for organizations. So we eliminated things that that were literally tied to a definition of an organization, such as a sub-organization. So a person is in a sub-organization, and things of that sort. And so this is where we are at the moment. When we were looking at this and removing, doing a side-by-side comparison between organizations and person, as we were removing properties, we erred on the conservative side. If there was any questions about whether it should, whether it shouldn't, we left it off at this point, so that we can let experience tell us whether some of the things that we removed from person, some of the properties that we removed might come back into play later. But we erred on the conservative side, or as conservative as we can be. So that's where we stand at the moment. Now this is in pending, and we're going to be talking in a few moments, I believe, about the again around the pending release process. So we're going to go into a period now of discussion, and so this is in pending, and so our conclusions here as to person are open to discussion. So that's basically.
Do we want to bring up that one of the important properties that we deliberately left off of person were the accredits and accredited by properties? Because those are very relevant to organizations, but we weren't entirely certain that they would be applicable to person.
In other words, whether a person serves as in a quality assurance role, would that be a way to frame that?
We also left off regulated by, I believe it was.
Right.
Yeah, so you've got approved and you have recognized, but the accreditation is really a formal quality assurance. So, you know, from the research that we've done, from what we know about accreditation, that is defined as a formal process, and a person, you know, might work for the organization that is responsible for the accreditation, but that a person could not issue accreditation. And the same as regulation, because by the definition of regulation, that's in the realm of legal, you know, so it wouldn't be a person, it would be an agent, an organization that has that responsibility. So yeah, that's
right. And we also took off the reverse properties for the accredited by, regulated by, because we didn't believe that a person on their own could be accredited, or that a person on their own could be regulated. So again, there is that distinction between a person and organization.
So going forward, you know, we may encounter stuff that makes us look at that, you know, makes us think about that differently, or you know, in terms of what's there and what's not there. But we thought we would try and err on the conservative side and let some experience inform where it goes. So that's where we are, and there's I posted a note to the Google group, and feel free to comment there on Credential Person as we go into this comment period leading up to the next release.
yeah, sounds good. And Eric did have a couple of comments in the chat of the usefulness to registrars, and that the person who may be issuing the credential, for example, can be the professor who issued the credential. Any comments? And Eric, you should have audio if you'd like to say anything.
Well, the person, Okay, if a person, one of the things we eliminated from it was affiliation relationships. If someone is affiliated with an organization, and then we simply assume that any issuing of a credential would be through the organization that the person is affiliated with, as opposed to person, which would in essence put them square into being what we call a credentialing, playing a credentialing role. So credentialing role in the way we looked at it was not an affiliation role. It isn't someone may actually process the thing and make decisions about it, but if that person is affiliated with an organization, then it's the organization that carries the credentialing role. I don't know, Eric, if that.
When you say cred, are you abbreviating credential, or are you abbreviating like college credit?
Eric, do you have?
He's saying credential.
Credential. Okay. So yeah, as Stuart pointed out, in that case, it would be the college or the university or whatever that actually issued the credential in that case. The learning opportunity may have been taught by the professor, and that would go to Stuart's point about having something on the learning opportunity that lets you sort of indicate, the name or the social media or some way of pointing to the person who did the teaching in that case, or the assessing in the case of assessments. But the credential itself would have been issued by the university in that case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we did talk about, in particular, say, badges being issued by credential persons, as an example of something that a person could, directly issue. But in the context of an organization who's responsible for the ultimate transcript behind, credentials, it would be the organization rather than the person. But we will take a look at all these notes and feedback in the chat, as we always do after these meetings, and discuss them and see if we need to make some changes. So please do put your input in there and let us know what you're thinking about. Carrie had a comment too. I don't know, Nate and Stuart, if you have any feedback on Carrie's comment.
Carrie, I'm not quite sure I understand. However, persons may have other QA credentials. You mean the person has the QA? I'm just a little confused by the question of the statement. Do you have sound, Carrie? Maybe. I don't know. I'm just a little confused by exactly what.
Well, Carrie, if you have audio, feel free.
I think I have sound. Can you hear me? Okay, good. I think the point I'm making is that accreditation, right, is normally a formal type of thing for organizations, but a person, let me just use this basic example, someone who is teaching programming may have, qualifications for that, right? So they may have certifications or a PhD or some kind of background that attests to their qualification of issuing this credential, that applies some kind of quality to it. So it would be different than what a formal organization would have, but also possibly pertinent to the, whoever's consuming the eventual earned credential, or the person evaluating whether they want to go to that person to be taught programming.
Well, I guess there are a couple things that fold into that. One, that would be that instructor is hanging off of what we would call a learning opportunity. So it's an instructor on a learning opportunity, and you're correct. As an old retired lawyer, when I see a class being taught by Lawrence Tribe at Harvard, it means a lot. It means a lot about what that class is. But the question is, does the course at Harvard, constitutional law, for example, at Harvard, have, it probably has 20 people who teach constitutional law. So it's where does that representation occur? Does it occur at a course instance level, which I think is somewhat below where we are, where a learning opportunity for us would be a description of constitutional law, where an instance of it would be taught by Lawrence Tribe. And in that case, but so I think we're describing two different things. One would be the learning the learning opportunity, at which point identifying Lawrence Tribe would make perfect sense, and that's what we said. We need to look to make sure we can do that. But at the same time, we have probably in terms of scope, carry more than anything else, hard time justifying Lawrence Tribe having a record in the registry or a record that describes his bio and his credentials and who he is and so forth. It may be simply a scoping thing. We agree, I think, that having that having a property where I can identify that this course, if the course is always Lawrence Tribe, that I could identify that. But I tried to draw in my post to the Google group the distinction between identifying somebody and describing them, full-blown record to describe them. And I
think I hear what you're saying, Stuart. I think mostly what I'm referring to, just to make sure you understood what I was saying, is not necessarily talking about a course, talking maybe about an independent person. So perhaps I'm that person who is teaching, and I'm not affiliated with an organization at all. And
so,
what are my
this is Carla. So I'm wondering, as we're saying this, if that individual then is not actually the credential person, but is actually the credential issuer, and that they need to be defined within that. So that's my assumption here, is that credential person is actually operating separately from that. And in that instance, Carrie, where you are an individual offering a credential, you would then be the issuer, and you define yourself there.
And that would fit. That would fit exactly. You would be playing the credentialing role, and it would fit. That kind of person could be here. So that could be, that could be somebody, who is a certified Microsoft trainer that actually offers training and actually does something, actually does that execution. That execution plays that credentialing role. Yeah. Yep. Well, I think I'll hand it back to you, Jean.
Good conversation. And as I said, we do look through, after these meetings, we go through all the comments in the chat, and we regroup on it, and for suggestions that need to be influence changes, those changes are made. So we appreciate it. I'm going to move on. Just a quick reminder about the CTDL release. So during the last TAC, we had a whole section of the PowerPoint that talked about the release process, and our next planned release is April 28, 2017. So this is just an excerpt of that prior presentation, because it also, for each meeting, we always have some new members, so they don't have all that past information, but we do have a review process, and this little graphic off to the right here shows what that process is, and what it all boils down to is that 2 weeks ahead of a release, anything to go out in that release will be in pending, and we had pasted the link to the pending view for the credential person up there somewhere in the chat, and maybe Nate could repaste it in there as well. But this is a completely separate location than the CTDL, and so it's kind of tucked away and hidden on the TAC page on the website. But this is where you can toggle to pending and see everything that's coming up, and then there's a 2-week review period before that release happens. So what we said was, there's we'll post that announcement to the Google group and to our technical planning homepage. We have a little announcement area. And then issues, all those things that go into pending have related GitHub issues. And so, feel free to go to GitHub and put your comments in addition to any that come out of these direct meetings. So, again, this means that on April 14th, the review period will commence. Now, if you go look now, you'll see there's the CE person is there, or the credential person is there and marked as pending, and you'll see some other things. So we don't necessarily wait until this day, so we don't have a backlog. So you could always just go to the pending view and toggle the pending and see everything that's coming up, and feel free to comment on it. Now, a lot of those things apart from the credential person are just technical things, or things that as we're implementing the CTDL with our partners, we find problems that we have to address, and so we go ahead and take care of those problems. So then the other reminder is just that we have, we want to drive everyone to GitHub so we can manage all of the feedback and issues through one location, as opposed to trying to track, emails and Google group issues and all that sort of stuff. So direct, feedback on what's coming up, go to GitHub, and if you don't have an account, just set one up. And just like every other site, if you can't remember your password, just do a password recovery. So that's how we're set up. And for those who would like to see the detail of the process, I'm going to go ahead and paste. I pulled that section of the PowerPoint out from last month, and I put it in the March folder, and so you can take a look at the detail around that. And I want to go ahead and pass it on to Nate and Stuart to talk about the ConditionManifest Proposal.
Okay. All right, so one of the newer parts of CTDL that we've been discussing recently is the condition manifest. And sort of the purpose of this is to allow organizations to define common sets of conditions that are referenced by other things. And so to go into some detail here, or some background, I guess, first I want to talk about condition profile. Now these bullet points here are taken straight from the guide, and essentially condition profile is a container for sets of conditions that you would then apply to other things, usually in the context of requirements, though not exclusively. So you could say that a credential may require something, and then it may recommend something else, and then a third thing may provide advanced standing for that credential, and so on. Same deal for assessments and learning opportunities. You may have an assessment that requires X, Y, and Z, and only is available in certain regions, and so on. And all of that information is encapsulated in condition profile. And so what we have here, again, taken straight from our guide, which is linked in the lower right, is a quick little diagram of condition profile. You see we've got the, do I have an arrow thing? Yes, I do. Here we go. You've got the credential over on the left, and in the middle is the condition profile itself, and it points out to all of the sort of relevant pieces of information that you need to know as far as what this credential requires, which is defined by the property that points to that condition profile. So we've got some examples of what a condition profile is. So here we've got the admission requirements for this degree here. Here we've got some more information about the Industry Fundamental Certificate Program and what you have to do to get into that. We've got another set of conditions for the application and enrollment procedures for students, and this is from another one of our partner organizations. And again, we've got the conditions for the HEMA Certified Health Data Analyst certificate, I believe. So anyway, each one of these is a condition profile. They're basically a block of information of varying sorts that tells you what you have to do to get a credential. Now there's a problem with this. The Problem is that many institutions, especially education-related ones, will have a common set of conditions, usually for getting into a given learning opportunity, maybe less so for finishing one, but very often for getting into one, you'll have the same set of conditions that apply to, say, all of the bachelor degrees or to all of the master's degrees or so on for a given organization. And if you were to describe this using only a condition profile and nothing else, you would basically have to copy that data into each one of those published descriptions of a credential. So if you had 4 degrees, you'd have to put the same conditions into each one of those degrees, and so your data gets kind of bloated. And we're looking at, and it also becomes more difficult to enter, and it introduces the possibility for mistakes, because if you have, say, a scraping process or a manual entry process, and you have, 2 different people entering that information on 2 different days, you might not end up with the same information in the system. So there's all kinds of little issues that are created by using only condition profile for this. So to solve this, what we've come up with is a condition manifest. And what this is essentially is a container for one or more condition profiles that are referenced via the same properties, like requires, recommends, advanced standing, and so on, that we currently use to point a credential to a set of conditions. So it acts as sort of a middleman, a stand-in, that you can then say that your credential, which we'll get to in a little bit, has a common set of conditions that then require, X, Y, and Z in a condition profile. And so here's a real simple graph. So you've got the organization, and we've got 2 new properties that I'll go into in a little bit, where the organization has a condition manifest, and this is our new profile here. And then you've got the 2 credentials that are offered by this organization that have a common set of conditions that, again, are stored here. So this condition manifest requires the conditions here. It recommends the conditions indicated here. And you see this credential also requires the conditions indicated here. So it's not, you don't have to pack everything into this. You can have additional, things directly on the credential in addition to using the condition manifest. So again, to kind of highlight that, you would say the requirements for credential A come from the common conditions, and then you go to there, you'd investigate, okay, what does this require? You see these conditions here. So it's the same as essentially copying the data from this and saying, this credential requires this. So again, it's a stand-in. And like I mentioned, this credential requires everything in here and these, because the requires are additive, or aggregate, I guess. So again, if you want more information on this, we've got a GitHub issue here that kind of goes through our thought process and the development of how we got to this point. And I believe the most recent post in that has kind of a summary of the condition manifest profile itself, and the 2 new properties has condition manifest and common conditions. So we've got one of our partners, Brandman University, has various degrees that they've got in our system, and so I went through and kind of picked out some, and you'll see that each one of these examples here has identical admission requirements. So this is sort of a real-world example of where condition manifest comes in handy. So what we want to avoid is having to republish all of these requirements for each one of these credentials. We would rather have a separate entity that exists kind of at the Brandman University level that each of these 3 degrees here could then reference. So again, this is more or less the same diagram as before, but rewritten so that it represents the example we just saw. So you've got your 3 degrees that all have common conditions, which are represented by the condition manifest, which itself, using one of our newer properties, entry condition, then points to the data that was in those admission requirements. And one of the things about the admission requirements is that they had some that were specific to current military. So again, I just wanted to show the sort of the flexibility of this, is that because these are condition profiles, you can do anything here that you could have done at the credential level. So that part hasn't changed. And so condition manifest is going to use existing properties. So again, if I go back to our example here, the properties that come off of condition manifest and point to the condition profiles are all going to be identical to the ones that come off of credentials, assessments, and learning opportunities. So we've got requires, recommends, advanced standing from, preparation from, and entry condition, which again is the one that we showed a moment ago. And of course the inverse properties as well. So you could say that if you have 3 credentials that are all required for something else, and you only want to indicate that something else once, again, you could use the condition manifest to point to that something else and then point all of your credentials at that something else. Now the advantage and potentially disadvantage, it may be kind of a double-edged sword, but the main advantage of condition manifest in that case would be that if those 3 or 4 credentials were ever required for or recommended for, say, a new credential that your organization comes up with, you wouldn't have to go and update the data for all of those individual credentials. You could just update the data for that one condition manifest profile, and because everything that points at it, references it in real time, anything that it points to will be considered the same as if it were directly attached to those credentials. I hope I'm making sense. It's a little hard to follow. I guess I don't have a diagram for that one, but so we've got a couple of questions in the chat here. Let me see.
Yeah, Robbie asked, can I jump in with Robbie?
Yeah, go ahead.
So what happens when conditions are shared among multiple institutions? Does each college have to have its own version of requires a high school and so forth? I think the CTDL itself, Robbie, doesn't preclude someone pointing to a condition manifest from some other organization. There's nothing at the level of the CTDL to preclude that. And you kind of frame it differently in the requires high school degree, requires graduation, requires diploma. That would all depend on the, I would think, on the property that maybe that third party is using. So, for example, you might have a condition profile created by organization A in which it talks about it as a diploma. But organization B could point to those requirements with a property that indicated, degree or something else. Now, so in the wild, the CTDL would support that because a condition profile is an entity with a URI and it's totally referenceable from anywhere on the web. Whether constraints are placed in a particular application profile like the CER, it's a different question. It's a different question. But the CTDL does not in and of itself preclude 2 organizations referencing either a common or even a condition manifest or even a condition profile if they're identified by URI in some other graph.
Right. Right. So again, to expand on what Stuart just said, so if you had another organization, say down here, and it was organization B that offered credential B instead of your first organization here, credential B could still point to the condition manifest controlled by organization A if they wanted to, because these condition manifests, as Stuart mentioned, would be identified by URI. So I'm not sure of a real-world use case or example of that, but it is certainly possible.
Hey Nate, there's probably real-world examples, relevant ones, in particular for licenses, where the license will have a requirement, and those requirements could be very specific, like certifications that they say if you meet the requirements for this certification, from another organization. Okay, yeah. So maybe that's one example.
That would make sense. Yeah. If you had requirements for a license that were, say, managed by a government, and you had, 3 or 4 different universities that all offered those licenses, they could all point to the requirements that were controlled by that sort of government institution. Mm-hmm. So, okay, that would be a real-world example of that.
I think that it kind of applies to Kelly's. Yes, I think that applies to Kelly's. Oh. Sorry, shouldn't speak for you, Kelly. Go ahead.
Let me see. Would it make sense to have a common organization such as, I'm from the CACC system. Oh, okay, on Robbie's question. Okay, all right. So did we answer you then, Kelly? Did that cover what you were looking for? Okay.
Yeah. My take, Kelly, was that's perfectly possible. I mean, the CTDL would make that possible, and it does. It sort of rides on Robbie's question.
Okay. So the two new properties, just to go into those real quick here, has condition manifest and common conditions. Real simple. The has condition manifest is what the organization uses to point to condition manifests that are controlled by that organization, and then the common conditions are what everything else uses to say, hey, these conditions apply to me. So that would be your credentials, your assessments, your learning opportunities, and whatever else we might come up with in the future that may need to leverage or utilize those condition manifest. That's what they would use to point at those. So nothing overly complicated with those. All right, so the next steps for condition manifest are going to be to discuss and gather feedback. So again, we've got the GitHub issue where we're developing this linked right here. So what we need to do is, I think we've got the theory of it pretty well nailed down, but maybe we need to refine the properties, the definition, usage notes, comments, things like that. Maybe see if there's any other properties that would be useful to have on condition manifest, like maybe a description or a name or something, stuff like that. So we've got to nail down all the details. We would like to be able to pull that off by the April release. Well, preferably sooner than that, but to at least have that ready for that release. So if we can do that, so much the better.
Nate,
yeah.
One thing that we were exchanging emails earlier this morning. We think we probably have property classes all correct. Properties and classes. The class, condition manifest, and the properties right. But there's a little bit of richness in the modeling of this. For example, a given credential might be subject to two manifests, two condition manifests. And the example we were playing with this morning is that you've got a university, and it has a condition manifest regarding everything across the university. In other words, it covers everything. Then you have within the university, you've got the School of Engineering. The School of Engineering has a condition manifest of everything that is global to itself. And then you have a credential from the School of Engineering that is in fact subject to both. It's subject to the manifest of the university, subject to the manifest of the School of Engineering. We don't see any problem with modeling that and accommodating that
right.
with what we're doing, but we want to play with that a little bit more, because there can be that level of complexity where, for example, a School of Engineering might have lab fees and stuff that aren't part of the general manifest.
Right, and kind of my thinking at this point is that those conditions would be concatenated together, just the same as if you had, 3 or 4 condition profiles that all had a requires property pointing to them from that credential. Same basic idea.
And in a linked data world, they would aggregate. I mean, you get the same property pointing to condition manifests, and in the linked world, right. Those would merge.
So it's exactly those kind of details that we still need to kind of iron out and make sure that we're all on the same page on, and that GitHub issue is going to be the central hub for all of that. So if you have any technical feedback or anything like that, go ahead and post there. So I think that is it for condition manifest. So our next step is the analysis and crosswalking of partner data. Mm-hmm. So go ahead and hand that off. And
just so, and I'd like to kick this over a little bit to Stuart, at least when we get to the slide that you'll see has a screenshot of some Google Sheets. But in our last meeting, as I mentioned earlier, we talked about how we're working with a subset of a fairly large group of partners across the United States. We have a subset of them, 9 and possibly a 10th, that we're working with to do a process for developing roadmap guides for all of our partners so anybody can implement the CTDL. And so essentially where we want that to end is they have done something, they have implemented something, so either we can go get their credential information and publish it to the registry, or if they wanted to do it directly, they could do that. So we have a presentation, and I'll put a link to that in the chat for those of you who want to revisit it or haven't seen it yet. Here's a direct link to last month's TAC where we got into a lot more detail. But the end goal is here. It's this link data on the web and to the Credential Registry. So that's the end game following this diagram that you can see better in the other PowerPoint. And this is where we are with the partners currently. We had prefaced it with doing a survey. Of course, they know if they have structured and unstructured data, and many of the partners have both, you know, especially universities and colleges that have a lot of different systems internally. So we're working on this mapping and analysis part and allowing some time to do it. It's a little time consuming for the partners, but it's not as though they have to constantly redo the mapping. So what we've asked them to do is look at their public information, you know, what they currently make public, not, you know, information that's not intended for the public to see. So, and that we're organizing a template for them that I'm going to ask Stuart to talk about in a second. So when they're doing this analysis, they can identify, well, some of the expected data, because for those of you who have really taken the time to look at the CTDL, you see there's a lot to it. And, you know, it's a dictionary, so it's not as though the partner would reference every single, you know, property and class and so forth and concept in that. So we wanted to help them out and provide a template and guidance on what to look for. Because we do see, definitely see trends across the types of credentials as to what is expected. You know, for example, if it's a credential that's some type of a degree, it would be expected that there is a learning opportunity, what CTDL calls a learning opportunity information along with that credential information. And if it's a certification body, for example, or a certificate issuing organization, that there would be an assessment, and then within those profiles, certain, you know, properties or concepts that may be relevant more frequently than others. And so let me stop there and ask Stuart if he could comment on the process and where we are with it in terms of this template.
Sure. What we're doing with the partners is there was a diagram a little earlier that we're showing only the bottom piece well, here I can. Oops. I'm going to pop back here for just a second. So this diagram illustrates 4 steps for taking a partner's data, native data that they have, it's either structured or unstructured, and through this through the process of these 4 steps, ending up, as Jean pointed out, with that data on the web, sitting there on the web. It could be in markup, in other words, they've got their credentials marked up, or it could be in CTDL records, waiting to be, you know, to be harvested in that mechanical sense, or through markup. That's the goal. And where we are, as Jean said, is we are at we're at this stage, and that is helping them analyze their own data and see how that data maps to the CTDL. And the exercise they're in at the moment is working on a crosswalk spreadsheet that that takes them through the main entities so that they can analyze their data in relationship to the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet is pretty straightforward. As Jean says, we have identified a select set of properties for each class. Here we're looking at credentialing organization. We've established a set of properties. This is some of them. There are actually more. And then we've taken our stab at stating what properties are required, what are required if they're present in your data. In other words, there's no sense requiring something if it's not present in the data. But if it's present, we'd like to see it. Then recommended and optional. And so you'll see, you know, here, as Jean was saying, here, agent type, what type of agent are you is required, and description is required, and the name is required, some of the obvious stuff. So the first column is the CTDL property. The second column is the class of entity, the type of entity that that property belongs to. And here you see there's QA organization and credential organization. So this is all about the organization. Over on the far, now each of these in the spreadsheets, by the way, are linked. So they can click on any of these and go to our definitions of what those properties are. And they can, where useful, also go to the guide for more help. The last two columns are, if you've got this data, where is it and what is it formed? So for example, this line that is partially filled in, we have the property description, and this kind of assumes that there is a field in a relational database system that they control called cred description, and that it is in and it resides in the reg system somewhere. So there's this made up. But the goal here is to go, okay, here's what the CTDL has, here's what's required, here's what's recommended, and do we have that data natively somewhere? And to do that mapping, so then the next phase is on that earlier diagram. When we go from step 2 to step 3, they can actually then, through various options that we're providing them, be able to automate by taking the data out of their system and mapping it over. So this is just a crosswalk, and these spreadsheets are working sheets for these 9 partners. So each of them has their own spreadsheets, and they're working to see how their data lines up with the CTDL. Now we're in this analytic phase that we're in right now. We first gave them spreadsheets that were blank, and discovered that that's a very bad idea because of the size of the CTDL. They just look at it and go, where do we begin? So this is a revision of that approach where we're saying, okay, here, you start here, you look here, and you see what you've got. So one thing that we would like to drive home about this process, not only are these 9 projects walking through it with us, one of the goals is for refining roadmaps. So one of the outcomes, while the outcome for each partner will be that they will have their stuff mapped and ready, the goal for us is that it helps us refine the documentation so that future people, others beyond the 9, will be able to go through this phase, the analytic phase, and get it done. So in essence, there's for each of the major classes, this is credential, then there's credentialing organization, then there's credential, then there's assessment profiles and learning opportunity, and we're anticipating. We're going to get together on April 18th to see kind of where everybody is, but we're anticipating that this may take a little while. This is a critical piece. Once they get the mapping done, I wouldn't say the rest is a piece of cake, but this is kind of the hard part. So expected data examples, let us know. If you have any comments or suggestions, inventory crosswalk. Jean, for some reason I'm going blank as to where these links go.
Well, what I did was I just took a copy of the draft and I put it into the TAC folder, so it's right there, and I put a copy of the direct URL in the chat. Okay. So it's just a copy of the template.
It's just the spreadsheet that you were just looking at, and the draft expected properties is a second spreadsheet that I don't think yet where we're trying to analyze those requirements, required or expected, which is better than requires, expected and expected at present, and so forth. Notice.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about that in the next section.
Notice that some of what ends up in the spreadsheet, what is expected and so forth, is being derived to a fair extent from the experience with the registry so far. What do people have? Currently, there are how many credentials in the 100 and over 100, I believe, credentials in WorkIt, and so we're looking at what are the patterns here for seeing what, in fact, we can expect to be present. So this is helping us, by the way, move toward the what we've been calling a thin CTDL profile. In other words, a profile that pairs it down and leaves lots in the optional and pairs it down to tighter constraints of what properties and classes. Okay, that's it. I haven't been watching whether there were questions, but shall we go on?
Yep.
Shall we go on?
Good deal. Yeah, so if anybody wants to take a look at that, if anybody has any other suggestions, you know, let us know. And then, so this is the last part of the presentation, the Credential Registry update. For this update, we're sticking to just one subtopic, and that's the usage and validation of the CTDL. And I'm going to ask Mike and Steve to take this section over.
Okay, so a key part of this, of course, is the validation. So we have, if you're familiar with the CTDL, there's an extensive schema. There's a element called JSON schema validation, which essentially is a vocabulary for validating a JSON or a JSON LD document, which will go into the publishing and the minimal expected data. So as noted here, there's a link to the sample of JSON schema. So the Credential Engine Registry will use it to validate incoming metadata. The validation is as simple as making sure something that has the data type of integer, decimal, date, etc. Actually, the content matches that. It certainly can be a little bit more extensive too, to make sure that if it's a vocabulary term, it matches the CTDL vocabulary. If it's a URI, for example, it's properly formatted as a URI. And then we have the CTDL version of JSON schema is generated, and it's strictly for the purposes of the Credential Engine Registry. Certainly outside the registry, entities can use CTDL in different ways. So we have a link here to the full schema that is generated, again, based on the current CTDL. The registry itself, when it validates those, we use the 4 top-level classes that are identified now. So it'll be a separate validation schema for the credential, agent, assessment, and learning opportunity. So publishing to the registry consists of formatting an envelope. An envelope is essentially a name for a kind of a document that has the properties like type and encoding. In this case, it uses Java Web Tokens, format as JSON, other things like version and community. When you encode your document, your metadata, I should say, there'll be a public key, and we are putting together a developer guide that will be released at some point. From the GitHub site, under the metadata registry or the credential registry, there's documentation that describes some of these elements. As I say, we'll have a more formal developer's guide coming soon. So when you publish, if you have, in this example, an agent with 5 credentials, they're not all in one envelope. You have an envelope with an agent that would be published separate from the 5 credentials. You don't include the agent in each of the 5 credentials or learning opportunities and assessments and so on. Each distinct class has its own envelope when you're publishing. So part of the validation is that it must pass validation, and we touched a little bit on the expected data and minimal data, and we'll look at that in a moment. So part of the validation is not just data types, but to make sure what we have defined as the minimum data is there as well. So here we have a link to a sample credential that is has all the elements, all the properties of a credential formatted, ready to be published. So as noted, in order discussions, the minimum data is an important thing. So we've been working with partners over the last several months to get an idea of what is the minimum viable data, which I guess will possibly lead to the part of the discussion for the thinner version of CTL, and what data is expected. Certainly, and that varies by credential types. And as noted before, the CR validation does include checks for the minimum viable data. So for a credential, right now in red are the properties that we have as the minimum. We make this a bit bigger here. So we have the obvious ones: name, owned by, description, subject web page, and the credential identifier, the CTID. And then yellow, we'll see the recommended ones, the roles as far as the accredited by, approved by, and so on, notation, status type, estimated cost and duration, industry type, jurisdiction keywords, occupation type, offered, recognized by, recommended, renewed, where it's a license, requires, revoked, subject, and version identifier. So certainly there's very little in terms of minimum data, and certainly we'd want to see more of the recommended data. So it doesn't change much for organization. Very little minimum data. The name, description, agent type, recommended, again, the relationships with entities like the accredited by, certainly address is recommended, sector type, departments, organization identifiers like DUNS, FIN, IPEDS ID, as well as image, jurisdiction keyword, NAICS, other roles like offers, owns, the OPID, recognizes, renews, regulated by, service type, social media, and subject web page. For assessment, again, similarly, the main ones being the name, the description, assessment type method, and then, again, role-related things like accredited by, approved by, I should say agent-related, and then assessment use type, notation code, entry conditions, cost, duration, keywords, offered by, owned by, recognized by, regulated by, requires, and then subject web page, and then target assessment and competencies. And learning opportunities similar to assessment, where you have the name, description, the learning method type, and then agent-related things like accredited by, approved by, codes, credit union type and description and value, entry conditions, cost, duration, program type, again, keywords, offered by, recognized by, subject web page, etc. So as noted, we're working on a guide for developers for how to publish to the registry. Once finished or in a publicly viewable stage, then it will be added to the CredReg site. So again, the validation, the key part of the validation is to ensure that we have useful quality data. And certainly the minimum data is an important thing to make sure the minimum is not too minimal so that the data is not useful. So then again, we're looking for feedback. So what are the current minimum data requirements too thin? What other, maybe the recommended ones really should be required, things that we perhaps missed that should be required, and so on. It's one thing having these things, but of course, how do we encourage people to really include the recommended data? If something gets published, will be published, and when we reject it if it doesn't have it. So find that balance between recommended and required.
Yeah. Good. There was a lot of discussion going on in the chat, which is wonderful. are there things happening in the chat, Steve, that you want to talk a little bit about? We've got a little bit of time here. I've got 11:08, so we can talk as much as needed about this because this is the last section for today.
Sure, so we can give people some time back too, but the one item I think I want to raise, there's good discussion going on in the chat. Seems like there's a general consensus that this sort of method of strong validation, meaning we don't just say, send us whatever JSON LD that technically comports to, you know, the CTDL, but send us this specific structure of JSON LD. Still valid JSON LD, so anyone who wants to graph it out later is welcome to do so. But from an API developer perspective, I've got a very strong structure, I got a clear API, and so all I got to do is follow the rules. I don't have to sort of wonder. So, you know, JSON LD graph experts will be maybe a little frustrated, but a lot of just sort of web HTTP developers will find this more convenient or easier to work with. That's the trade-off we're making, I think. The one point I wanted to make just about validation, you know, Mike mentioned that we're validating with JSON schema, and we have structure levels of validation and data types, arrays, integers, you know, that type of validation. We also will probably implement some custom validations to provide a deeper sort of level of control over what's provided in certain fields. So, you know, JSON schema allows you to go down to basically the level of like a regex, a regular expression where you can just describe this string needs to be match this pattern. But it's possible we may need deeper validation than that, meaning if you publish something, maybe it has to, if you publish a credential, it refers to an organization, but the organization doesn't exist. Do we have to reject that and suggest that you publish the organization before you submit the credential? Just as an example of kind of richer validation that wouldn't be exactly available to you via JSON schema, but that we may build custom in the product, in the API, and then we would express that basically with descriptions to say, we're checking for a string here, or an ID here, but that ID must already exist in the database, so you'd get some notation giving you clues as to what's expected of you. So that's just coming. We'd welcome feedback as to whether that's a bad idea or a good idea, or how we should, you know, sort of control for those types of, you know, richer validations that might not just be a string or a regular.
I like Damon's suggestion that maybe a similar 5-star roadmap could be used here. It's a good idea. Is there anything else in the chat that deserves some discussion? There's a lot of good information in there that we'll definitely want to, you know, look at as we meet internally, and we definitely want some feedback. And I think that it's going to be important to get the developer guides going and have some developers, just like we're working with our partners that issue credentials, who are willing to do a little, you know, playing around with it.
Yeah, Jeannie, just to say, I think I summarized in my comments sort of where the consensus ended up in that chat. So I don't think we have sort of loose ends in the chat. But anyone who thinks that got missed, you know, feel free to, you know, speak up.
All right, well, fantastic, and thanks, Kelly, for volunteering. We heart volunteers. So this is where we are, and these are our next steps. Are you know, we want feedback is encouraged. You know, we want your feedback during this meeting, but in between the meetings, since we only meet monthly, you know, please do go ahead and take a look at the GitHub issue for ConditionManifest. Take a look at that expected data, all the URLs that we gave. All of that information is in the March Google Drive folder for this meeting, so it's all rounded up there, so you don't have to just use the chat, you know, for those URLs. And give us your feedback. We're looking forward to the next meeting to let you know more about how it's going with the partners in that co-design, and then, you know, more about the credential registry. Our next meeting is the last Friday of April, and that will correspond to the next release. So if there aren't any other questions or comments, I think we can cut out a few minutes early. All right.
Thumbs up all around.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day and a wonderful weekend.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.